Hi, my name is Bim and I want to make games. If you're like me, you've consumed countless game dev videos. What's one more? By now, my flashing foliage has ideally moistened your ocular organs well enough to get through this video. To start, we need to outline three basic things. Firstly, we'll need a game paradigm. Will your game be 2D or 3D? What game loop will underlie everything else, such as first-person shooter, platformer, or roguelite? Your choice should be something you enjoy and is generic. That way you can steal from other games. Next up is the novel game mechanic. This is your twist, a game mechanic you thought wasn't done justice or perhaps is unique. A clear example would be the portal gun from the Portal series. Teleportation wasn't not novel, but applying the mechanic to brain-teasing puzzles was. Finally, we've arrived at the core systems. These are the functional systems your game needs to achieve your selected game loops. Examples range from player interactions to level loading systems. For my game, I've chosen a 2D puzzle platformer as my paradigm. My novel game mechanic is to allow the player to connect objects so that they share physics interactions and properties. I'll refer to this mechanic as entanglement. Here are two squares separated by a chasm the player cannot jump. With the entanglement feature, the player will be able to bind both squares and push one of them to move the opposing block over the chasm. Because one of the two squares is on solid ground, the floating block cannot fall. I have further ideas for property sharing, but for now we're going to keep it simple, just like this segue to selecting a game engine. When it comes to game engines, this project could be done in any, so I've chosen to do it in QuickBasic 64. Just kidding, I'll be using Unity. If you are a beginner, I think Unity is a great option due to its community support. Otherwise, use whatever game engine you feel like. I defined the systems I required in 3 blocks. The player input, environment manager, and the UI input.
When all scope is lost, they will act as a guide to pull me back to shore.
We're gonna get started on the player input. I decided to try something new and use the Unity input system. I really like the idea of making controller schemes which it provides, and I left a link in the description in case you wanted to learn how to do this. My plan for the input system is to store references to each subsystem that the player manipulates through their inputs. The script will receive triggers from the player's keyboard and then tell the relevant systems what to do. So without further ado, let's begin our first script. For this first script, we're going to need a reference to the player input provided by the new Unity input system. Then we're also going to need a reference to a non-existent player movement class and non-existent entanglement manager class. So let's go ahead and make those classes real so my IDE doesn't at me. If you're interested in the IDE I use JetBrains Rider. No, I do not pay for it. I was a student. Perfect. So, just as I mentioned before, I'm going to be creating 2 new references, one to the player movement class we just made, and one to the entanglement manager class we just made. The next step is to listen for the inputs in the update method. With the new input system, you can assign a typed output for any input. My intention is to capture these outputs and send them to the relevant subsystems. For the move input, we're going to capture a direction given as a float. For the jump input, we will capture a boolean, and same goes for the entangle input. The rationale for saving this information in a controller class is to ensure all game state information is available from one place. A use case would be providing the direction information to the player animator without having to change the movement class. With the inputs captured, I'm now going to give the information over to the empty scripts I made. I'll define an update data method in each class and then use magic to auto-generate empty implementations. I also decided to add in another boolean that says if we're grounded or not in the movement script. Ferns keep telling me Celeste movement is the best movement out there. This movement script is going to be a game of broken telephone. I'm going to take my favorite words they said and base my jump and movement functions off those. From my understanding, the jump height of the player scales with how long you press the jump button, up to a maximum. I created a minimum maximum jump velocity that the jump method is going to increment towards until the jump input is released. The jump method only gets called when a jump trigger has been given. The trigger will be updated in the regular update method for snappier response time. The execution of the trigger, however, will wait for the fixed update method because that is when the Unity physics gets updated. The logic of the jump is as follows. If the player is at the maximum jump velocity, then reset the jump boolean. If the player is on the ground, then set the jump velocity to the minimum value. If the player is not on the ground but is still holding the jump trigger, then increase the jump velocity. If the player is not on the ground and the jump boolean is no longer true, set the jump velocity to the player's y velocity. Before we can give the script a test, we're going to have to prepare some game objects in the Unity scene. Here I've created a default sprite cube to represent the player. I added on the player controller script, the player movement script, and a rigid body 2D component and a box collider 2D component. Inside of that player object, I then created 2 more empty game objects and added the player input component and the entanglement manager script respectively. After that, I went ahead and created a Unity tile map grid and palette. I used shapes provided by the 2D sprite package. For clarity, I will post a list of packages I imported for this project in the description. So as you can see, I've drawn a simple platform and added a rigid body 2D component and tile map collider component. Don't forget to set your player's rigid body setting collision detection to continuous, and also don't forget to set your platform's rigid body setting body type to static. If you're silly like me, you probably also left your player sprite behind the camera for a few minutes. Don't do that. Despite the ground boolean from earlier being set to false, it appears I created an unstoppable flying square. I guess it really is easy to make mistakes when you're programming at 10 times speed. Anyways, turns out I was giving the jump into the grounded boolean, and it also turns out that my script didn't give a frick if I wasn't jumping anymore. So, like any good programmer, I shuffled some booleans around and added jump release input to shut down any tomfoolery my script was getting up to. One last thing, clamp the jump velocity to guarantee the maximum jump height. Now if we jump, we can see the player will return to the ground if the jump input is released, or if it hits the maximum velocity. The next step is going to be determining if the player's on the ground. I decided to create a new empty game object inside the player object that I called feet. I gave my feet a box collider 2D and set it to be a trigger. Then I reduced the size of the box collider and positioned it so that only the player's bottom side would trigger it. You can achieve a similar effect with a raycast, but I prefer to use Unity methods when I can. This new object now needs a script that determines player's grounded boolean. Using onTrigger 2D methods that come with the mono behavior, we can set the grounded boolean according to the respective triggers. After I was done playing with my feet, I added a new public variable for it inside the player controller, and then set the grounded boolean to the feet's boolean. Of course, I didn't forget to assign my feet to the player controller in the inspector. That would be dumb. Yeah. A small but important step is to assign a layer to feet. That I will call, you guessed it, feet. We only want feet to interact with the ground, so inside the Unity player settings, under the Physics 2D section, adjust the layer collision matrix to reflect this. Would you look at that? The unstoppable flying square is now a much more grounded individual with a variable jump height depending on how long we held jump. The jump is a little floaty for now, but that will be remedied later. The next thing on my list to do is to add a basic movement method. I want a lot of freedom to play with the time it takes the player to speed up and slow down. Inside the player movement script, I'm adding a public float called top speed. The new move method, which will be called in the fixed update, creates a target velocity based on the current direction input, and then uses a really nifty vector tool called smooth damp. Smooth damp will smoothly transition a vector to a target vector over a given time. The reference velocity in the third parameter is intended to be where you would set the player velocity. I didn't because I am silly. For the time parameter, I created 2 more public floats that are called time to top speed and time to 0 speed. Using a ternary operator, I check if the player is moving or not. This way I can control the time it takes to speed up and slow down separately from one method. I just need to set the values for the new movement parameter and oh my god, it's actually working first try! Yes! Like me, you've probably experienced some bumpy behavior on the allegedly flat ground. We can fix this sussy baka by adding a composite collider 2D to the grid object and then changing the original tile map collider setting used by composite to true. And would you look at that? No more bumpy behavior. With the basics out of the way, I feel comfortable coming back to this in my next video, where I will focus on refining the movement and the jumping mechanic to mimic what I think I know about the game Celeste. I want to end by talking about my goals with this video series. I've been making games alone for a while now and it can be kind of lonely, so this is my attempt to inject myself into the game maker community here on YouTube. I want your feedback, I want to see what people are making, and I just want to keep making games and getting better at it. So like, honestly, any comments, likes, sharing the video, like that would mean a lot to me, and I honestly am looking forward to continuing this series. Bye!